Hasan Spiker is an Anglo-American philosopher and metaphysician. He spent his early years in Cambridge before dedicating over a decade to studying the traditional Islamic sciences in the Middle East. He then returned to the UK to complete an MPhil in philosophical theology at Cambridge, where he has been carrying out his doctoral research since. He's a prominent voice in the contemporary revival of traditional metaphysics and the author of multiple books, including Hierarchy and Freedom and a whole series about modernity. I consider him one of my teachers. Shaykh, it's an absolute honor and privilege to host you at this podcast.
Walaikum assalam. It's absolutely lovely to finally meet you, Luqman. Alhamdulillah.
Welcome. And we'll begin on a positive note before discussing some of those crises. As you might know, in the UK, we've got a new Prime Minister, Andy Burnham. He shook up his cabinet, but one position that remained is Shabana Mahmood, the Home Secretary. And she's been on somewhat of a crusade to stifle free speech and free expression. And in continuing that, her first act in a dystopian world will be to charge you with corrupting the youth, the Socratic charge. But rather than the hemlock, you will be banished to a desert island. But in her mercy, she will let you take three books with you for all time, three books that have had great impact on you over the course of your life. Which three books would you choose and why?
Goodness. Wow. I mean, if I was supported by that delightful creature, I think that I would try to cheat. I think the first book that I'd take with me would probably be Al-Futuhat al-Makkiyah by Ibn Arabi, because it is one book, but it just happens to be 30 volumes. So that would definitely be a choice. I think I'd also want to have Abu Thana al-Alusi's Ruh al-Ma'ani. It's another 30-volume work. It's a tafsir. Absolutely extraordinary work by a 19th century Iraqi. Well, he's an exegete of the Quran, but that book has absolutely everything. It has all manner of metaphysical questions and investigation. It has basically every theological debate you care to think of, you'll find there somewhere, and loads of Akbarian metaphysics. So that would be an absolute must as well. And I think my third choice would definitely be The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. And for me, that is a guidebook for Sufi wayfaring par excellence, as well as being written in some of the most beautiful prose that the English language has ever been written in. So I think those would be my three.
Oh, wow. Well, if we had this podcast a little while earlier, I would have shown the camera around to maps of Hobbiton and elsewhere. So yeah,
Oh, wow.
I've often heard about the Sufi interpretation of the Lord of the Rings. Who would you regard as the Sheikh and the Sufi master, and who's the disciple, and what is that journey? What is the equivalent of, say, the Monte Altair of in within Lord of the Rings?
Well, it's definitely, the Shaykh is definitely Tom Bombadil.
Right.
Gandalf
Yeah.
is more of a muqaddam, really. And of course, that's not going to come through in the movies,
Mm,
as you'd expect, because, of course, Tom Bombadil doesn't appear in the movies.
absolutely.
He appears in the Amazon series, but it's absolutely horrendous. The less
Yeah.
said about that, the better, I'd say. But he is the Sheikh because the ring, as symbolizing dunya and ego, and really just attachment to finite things, and the making of finite worldly goods and egoistic attachments divine beings, essentially, the deification of attachments. And, if you remember when they visit Tom Bombadil in the Old Forest, what is extraordinary about him is he goes a step beyond the very wise, like Gandalf, who went to destroy the thing, because he picks up the thing and it has absolutely no effect on him.
Mm,
He's immune from the power of the ring.
mm,
And I think that really is, in a way, the highest station of the path, also in Sufism, is that you're not simply trying to overcome ego and reach fanat, right? Which is absorption in the vision of the divine, but you're actually overcoming the world entirely so that you can live in it, go through it
mm.
as the shepherd of being, right? As the Khalifa, only to elevate its state without any danger to your own spiritual actualization, fulfillment, and realization.
Mm,
So, in that sense, Tom Bombadil is definitely the Shaykh, and Frodo is definitely the Murid,
mm,
who does ultimately cast the ring into the fires of Mount Doom.
mm. Oh, fascinating. Well, I think nothing is emblematic of modernity and materialism as the technology of the ring itself, and overcoming that and being completely immune to being in the world but not of it. I think Tom
Mm.
Bombadil definitely is a Sheikh Al Akbar within that universe. Speaking
Mm.
of Sheikh Al Akbar, I'm very patiently waiting for Eric Winkle's translations as I cannot access the original. So
Mm.
it'll be a while till I can take the entire collection with me on a desert island. How has that work personally impacted you over the course of your life? Well, why is it so central to you?
Well, that's a very good question. I think really the influence of Sheikh Al Akbar is felt everywhere, even when we're not really aware that it's coming from Sheikh Al Akbar. So for me, the community that I grew up in and the first influence that I had of Sufism was really the work of Sheikh Muhammad ibn al-Habib, the great Moroccan sage, the great Moroccan saint who died in 1970. We were always told that he was 114 years old. I think it turned out that he was more like 99, but it
Mhm.
was still a very venerable and grand old age. And we used to sing his diwan, and his diwan, although he's not classified as an Akbarian Sufi, nonetheless, the influence is so it's so all pervasive and ubiquitous that, well, it turns out in retrospect that very much Sheikh Muhammad ibn Habib is to be interpreted as an Akbarian Sufi very definitively. It's just that influence goes unnamed.
Mhm.
That's partly the result of a kind of amnesia that takes place within Sufi communities in the immediate aftermath of colonialism, where they don't quite know what they're dealing with anymore. They're still singing it, but it's not quite clear what it is. So, I mean, for me, growing up, Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad, the really, really most profound line of poetry, and this is in my early teens,
Mhm.
when I'm growing up in Cambridge and I'm hardly living the ideal Islamic life. I mean, I'm with my peers, ordinary English kids growing up, but I was always very, very inspired by this line. بطنت أوصاف ذاته وتجلت في الآثار إنما الكون معان قائمة بالصور. Right? So this is from the Diwan of Sheikh Muhammad Habib. It says, the attributes of his essence, the qualities of his essence were hidden,
Mm,
but they became manifest in the existence traces, right? إنما الكون معان قائمة بالصور.
mm,
This world is only meanings. That's what it is. This world is only meanings set up in images,
mm,
right? For me, that was an extraordinarily resonant kind of answer to the prevailing materialism. I grew up in a school of 2,000. I went to a school of 2,000 students for whom atheism was basically an official religion. And it was the assumption that you just were atheists. And everyone believed in evolutionism very enthusiastically without knowing really anything at all about it. And there were two people in the school who would admit to having any kind of religious faith, two Christians. So I was always caught within this dilemma of coming from a very, very, very genuinely religiously committed, spiritually oriented household
mhm,
where there are all these books of Sufi metaphysics and really interesting things on my shelves, and I would dip into them, usually just the preface, but be inspired enough by that for it to be really beneficial. And I was always trying to make sense of why my peers seemed to not understand any of that at all, and assume a completely different outlook on life. And so essentially, that kind of that kind of principle, that kind of concept, which is essentially an idea of there being an intrinsic significance to the world, to the world not only containing intrinsic symbolism, but actually, in some sense, having symbolism and significance as its substance rather than matter, right? It was very
Mhm.
inspiring to me. And later on, I found out that this is straightforwardly Akbarian theophanic metaphysics. So, in that sense, Sheikh al-Akbar inspired me very, very early on.
Mhm.
Um, and it was only later on that I realized that it was a Sheikh al-Akbar.
Wow. And interestingly that you mentioned that name, Sheikh Mohammed ibn al-Habib, he has a direct influence in the UK through one of his students, Sheikh Abdelkadir al-Sufi, and
Mm-hmm.
who is based in Norwich. And I understand that your parents actually came to Islam through that community.
Yeah.
It's an oft forgotten part of British Islamic history, at least those of us who weren't part of that circle. I mean,
Mm.
we get some kind of glimpses of it from the people who came from that movement, under Summer Clark. We've got Peter Sanders, Ian Abdul Latif Whiteman wrote a brilliant book about that era in
Yeah.
his lifetime.
Average white man.
Yeah,
Fantastic.
wonderfully written book.
Beautiful.
Albeit slightly critical of those years, or at least
Mm.
how the movement
Yeah.
sort of ended. What was your experience of growing up within the wider Murabitun movement and the impact it's had on your outlook since?
Well, I grew up in a family who had left that group. So I was never actually myself part of the order.
Right.
But my family always had a very, very balanced attitude towards the light and the darkness in that group, because there were many who left, and it became a kind of whipping horse for the rest of their lives. And then, of course, there were those who remained and remained within the group and remain to this day. And we were kind of in the middle, in the sense that we acknowledged some significant benefit to the community and to the teaching of Sheikh Abdelkadir and so on, and the enduring benefit of his works, while realizing that there may have been certain limitations for whatever reason, from whatever angle, from whomsoever it was coming. Um, and in a sense, in a way, that's just like any group. Um,
Hmm.
but I grew up, although my parents had already left the group, they stayed in the group, and my father from 1972 to 1982. Um, we still recited the word of Sheikh Mohammed and Habib, and we still had the books of Sheikh Abdelkadir on our shelves. And, as I said, I grew up dipping into those works and really being profoundly inspired by some of his radical takes, really,
Mm.
where there's essentially a deconstruction and this kind of deep critique of Western civilization as it is today, from this metaphysical perspective, this perspective of transformative Sufi metaphysics. And it was very, very inspiring. So, as you know, the teachings of the group were based on those of Sheikh Mohammed ibn Habib, who's a genuine saint of the old school, who I think, the time that we're living in really lacks figures like this. I think it's quite straightforward to say that. You'd be really, really hard pressed to find a figure like Sheikh Mohammed ibn al-Habib in this time, who really combines that deepest Sufi realization with profound scholarship and a deep understanding of the school of Sheikh al-Akbar. You mentioned Peter Sanders, the great photographer, who's an old family friend, and he used to tell us, because he was actually there in 1972 in the
Yeah.
Zawiya. It might have been 1971, but it was before Sheikh Mohammed al-Habib died. And he recounts how Sheikh Mohammed al-Habib would come down from his rooms, his tower, essentially, where he would wait until he was to come down to greet the guests, and they would be in the Zawiya itself. And he recounts how you could feel Sheikh Mohammed al-Habib coming, because you would start to feel an ecstatic presence just before he appeared. And this
Mm.
clearly happened repeatedly. He says he started to realize that this is related to his advent, essentially.
Mhm.
And there is imbued in his word this extraordinary baraka. It really does seem to have been designed for this time. It has this extraordinary kind of revitalizing effect, which other great awrad, which certainly are of similar or perhaps even greater stature, who knows, than the word actually formulated by Sheikh Muhammad Habib. But there somehow seems to be this special permission for that word in this time. And Sheikh Muhammad ibn al-Habib predicted that there would be a revival of Islam through Western converts. And in that
Mm.
sense, his prediction is quite similar to that of Imam al-Rawas in the 18th century, the great Rifari sage, who has had a famous vision in which he foresaw a very similar future. And so I think Sheikh Abdelkadir's group was absolutely extraordinary. They really were people who left the world and followed the way. They really left the world behind and gave their all. There was an extraordinary dedication. I think there was a real transmission because of their rootedness in the teachings of Sheikh Mohammed al Habib. And they famously squatted a line of Georgian houses in Bristol Gardens in London, a street which, if they were to own it today, would probably be worth hundreds of millions. Well, I'm sure it would be. And they were very interesting. They were all called upon to take on a craft, whether it was shoemaking or bookbinding or whatever it happened to be. They would go around, I don't know how advisable this really was, but they would go around London, in their full turban and jalaba and so on, very visibly Western converts. And they would stay up all night doing ecstatic hadras. And it was really a very, very interesting, extraordinary group. It's also the case that he, having been an actor in Fellini movies and also a playwright for the BBC, a screenwriter, he was in all of those kind of countercultural arts and culture circles in 1960s Britain.
Mhm.
And there are all sorts of stories. I mean, God knows how true they are, if some of them are apocryphal or not. I mean, they say that he was the one who inspired George Lucas with the clothing for the Jedi and some of the core ideas of the Star Wars films, and apparently he also inspired Eric Clapton with the Layla story and so on. God knows if these are true, but the reality is there are many people who came to the teachings of Sufism who were from those 1960s counterculture movements and various of the musical phenomena of the time and the arts phenomena of the time and poetry. So you had people like, for example, Harun Sugic, who was a Hollywood actor. You had Daniel Abdul Moore, who was a beat
Mm.
poet who knew Ginsberg and others. You had someone like Abdulatif Whiteman, who we already mentioned, who was in Mighty Baby and the Action and had the same manager, his band, as the Beatles, George Martin. And you had Peter Sanders, who's this great photographer, was this great photographer of Jimi Hendrix and other great musicians of the 60s. And of course, he then became this kind of the photographer par excellence of the Muslim world.
Mm.
So I think it was a really interesting bridge, I think, for people, just like so many of these different groups have been bridges. And this was essentially linking the worlds of popular art and culture and the kind of counterculture movement of the 1960s, including some of the existentialist philosophy, because that's one of the things that Sheikh Abdelkadir would draw upon in works like The Way of Muhammad, with the profound metaphysical teachings of Islam. And so I think that's enabled people who came from that group to have a unique perspective and often a unique impact on those around them. And I think that's been ultimately a very positive and healthy thing.
Yeah, I mean, from that group, we see a litany of really extraordinary individuals emerging, which makes looking at that period not just some kind of sociological obscure thing to do, but rather what happened and what light was he carrying from Sheikh Mohammed ibn Habib
Exactly.
to continue that.
Mm.
from reading at least Sheikh Abdul Whiteman's book, one does get a sort of a warning about charismatic figures, particularly
Mm.
in Islam, and putting one's figurative eggs and all in one basket.
Mm.
What lessons can one glean from that aspect as well?
Well, I think that the development of cults is a kind of necessary exigency of our conditions, the conditions of the time, the situations that we find ourselves in. It's no surprise. It's kind of inexorably, inescapably going to happen.
Mm.
Um, and I suppose it's a bit of a charged term to use the word occult, and recollections may vary, interpretations may be different, brandings and the words that we use to describe different phenomena may be different, widely divergent, and indeed, people have very, very different understandings of the nature of that group and other similar groups. I think that we are very, very prone in our time to think that we are well to form cults, to become involved with the reverence of a charismatic individual and give ourselves over to that individual as a kind of reaction to the modern world, where we're seeking an alternative morality, we're seeking an alternative world picture,
Hmm.
and we have a potentially a kind of romanticism about a lost world that, well, we were never really part of, but we kind of infer it from the ugliness of the modern world and the frustration of the modern world and the breakdown of the family and the
Hmm.
loneliness and isolation and so forth. And we try to construct different ways of ameliorating that, of alleviating that alienation. That I mean, you could sum up the failure of modernity and it has been summed up in this way as a failure of autonomy, the failure of autonomy, the failed promises of post-modernity and the lie of self-creation, and so we seek to recreate a kind of hierarchical social order, and inevitably that's going to take place on a kind of small micro level because it's not possible for it to be on the horizons writ large, of society writ large in this time because of
Hmm.
the total ascendancy of modernity.
Hmm.
And so we tend to form these little groups around charismatic individuals who are probably invested with far more authority than their real training or realization allows or justifies. And so I think the traditional Shaykh pre-modernity, and certainly before you have these convert kind of LARPing communities, is never susceptible to cultish behavior. It's just not there at all. But that's because the principles are all there intact, and the checks and balances of the Sharia are all there very, very clearly.
Hmm.
And so it can't really deteriorate into that. It's also because traditional education systems were intact, and that gave people criteria. The Marids were supposed to be empowered with knowledge in order to be able to separate the wheat from the chaff and not to be misled. They
Hmm.
knew the principles where they knew what red flags there would be and what lines were not to be crossed and so on. But the thing is, we tend to be very, very credulous. And so we allow ourselves to hang on the every word of this charismatic figure, and then you think that then you get these kind of inner circles, and people start to imagine that every word that emanates from that person's mouth is some sort of holy revelation, even when he had no such intention. And people live their lives and really miss out on their lives, I think, to a large extent, in this haze of piety. But at the same time, there's much benefit to be had. So it's not a matter of condemnation,
Hmm.
blanket condemnation, um, or encouraging us all to, form our own cult as soon as humanly possible. But it's I think just about realizing that this is one of the it's going to happen in our time that people will feel the need to create these communities in which there's a sense of, even if it's imposed and constructed, there's this sense of normativity, which they're not finding within conditions of modernity.
Yeah.
I think that we do need to, going forward, what is needed is the cultivation of a real sense of not individualism, but individuality on the part of Muslims, for us to become really, really substantial individuals. And that goes against this idea of conformity to the community and kind of submission to the community and to the leader, and somehow this some sort of Sufi overcoming of our individual personality and so on. I think that's a misinterpretation of Sufism. What real Sufism is calling us to is to become really substantial, powerful individuals, chivalrous and knowledgeable, because our ultimate vocation on this earth is to be the Khalifa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So,
Yeah, I think particularly in times of crisis, we find people reaching out for people who will sell them the quickest solution. And that is ultimately what we've seen in the history of the past century. That is what Carlyle was sort of arguing with the great man theory, and people still adhere to that. And in the age of the strong man politics and the demagogue now, we realize how important it is to cultivate the kind of values that you've just been speaking about. But on the point of crisis, and we'll definitely get back to Ibn Arabi and Futuhat later on. But we are living in an age of a major crises. Well, crises, plural. But one of them, and I think this is something you've very early on called the defining crisis of our time, and that is post-October 7th, the world we live in. And by extension, again, the centrality of what happened there are the people living in Palestine, but it has had an irrevocable impact on us as Muslims in the West and what it means to be Muslim in the West. But interestingly, when that leadership was most needed, a lot of our self-appointed ulama and scholars just went into occultation during that period. And it did help in that time to that you, with great lucidity, you went beyond the headlines and immediately diagnosed Gaza as like the ultimate manifestation of a deep metaphysical crisis. I know you penned a beautiful article very early on in November, and it reminded me much of like what Zygmunt Bauman wrote, argued that, after the Holocaust, it wasn't so much a breakdown of modern civilization, but a terrifying perfection of everything leading up to that point. And while then he was talking about obviously fascism, you pointed to liberalism as also, more or less uh, the other side of the same coin of modernity. How do you view Gaza as the inflection point of Islam in the West? And how is it effectively the eulogy of the Western liberal order?
well, I think that liberalism has this built-in tendency to flip suddenly,
Mm,
even overnight, into authoritarianism. And liberalism arose as a solution to some of the fundamental tensions which are intrinsic to a very, very idiosyncratically European context. And so they arise out of what I've described in my book, The Unraveling of Intelligibility, as the first volume, as the five bifurcations of Western civilization. And one of those bifurcations was faith and reason. One of those bifurcations was between knowing subject and nature. So essentially, liberalism is a response to the religious wars of the Reformation. It's a way of trying to apply a philosophy which concentrates on that which can be perceived as neutral and shared ground and not confessional. And it's not known by everyone that John Locke's theory of toleration, as one of the most important architects of the philosophical structure of liberalism, is founded, its justification epistemologically is religious skepticism. It is founded on the idea that, well, given empiricism, we can't possibly know the truth of the matter when it comes to these competing truth claims about religion. So we'd better not set up society on the basis of the unjust and false claim that we know the truth of the matter. And so what ends up happening in the unfolding of history is you have this concretization of liberalism as a philosophy whose central value and guiding principle is non-interference. And the way that John Stuart Mill explains this on Liberty very beautifully and strikingly is, it doesn't mean it's entirely true, but is that it serves all men better to allow each other to pursue their own vision of the good, their own conception of the good in their own way, than for us to impose some putatively universal, capital G good upon people, thereby cramping their, that's a paraphrase obviously of John Stuart Mill, but thereby compromising their intrinsic right to self-determination. Why do we have that? It's because we can't know, even if there was one universal good, a standard that we were all to conform to, there could be in principle, but how on earth would we know it? We don't have the capacity, we don't have the right cognitive apparatuses to know such a thing. All we can know is the individual freedom that we have proximate, direct access to as individual knowing subjects. And we exercise that freedom. We use our rational capacity to evaluate the world and to determine our own criteria for action, to determine our own criteria for the unfolding of our lives. And that's what society should be based upon. It should be based on non-interference. And the only justification for interference is in order to prevent harm. But again, harm is defined reductively so that it only embraces really material harm. And then you could include something like reputational harm, which is ultimately material harm. But there's no moral harm or spiritual harm, because that has all been relegated to the status of merely subjective, right? That is the domain of autonomy. You need to create your own value, your own meaning, your own morality, your own world picture. That's your domain. No one's to interfere, right? That's not a domain which has public implications or that can be legislated for or imposed in any way. So it all sounds so wonderful. It's intuitively correct to the modern mind, but the problem is what it conceals is this fully fledged metaphysics of the world, which it wants you to think is just pure neutrality. And it's the furthest thing from neutrality, which is exactly this idea that there is this irrevocable split between knowing subject and the world and the extramental world, not limited to the sensible particular world, whatever is outside of our minds, we don't know, but whatever is outside of our minds, whatever is real. And never the twain shall meet. Essentially, the domain of the extramental can only be known in any objective sense quantitatively, and in terms of empirical data, and everything else is up for grabs. Well, everything else includes all of the most important questions of ultimate human concern: truth, goodness, and beauty, right? So this is the great lie of liberalism. It gives the impression of being uniquely, because of its non-dogmatism and its invitation to everyone to have their place in society, ostensibly, but because of its underlying metaphysics, it gives the impression of neutrality when it's in fact enforcing a extremely reductive account of human nature and flourishing on everyone. And because there are no intrinsic moral criteria other than the assumptions that itself needs to make in order to get going, in order to then say there are no intrinsic moral criteria. What ends up triumphing under the ascendancy of liberalism is might is rightism. It will inexorably triumph. Ultimately, despite all of the rhetoric and all of the niceness and all the high-sounding stuff about freedom, it will ultimately flip into will to powerism and might is rightism and Machiavellianism, various whatever shade of the above. And I think that's what we saw happening. There's a Portuguese author, I don't know how to pronounce his last name, Bruno Macauis or something. Do you know how to pronounce his name? But he talks about Gaza as the end of hypocrisy. So it's simply the moment where it's the masks off moment where liberalism realized that there's no point in keeping up this pretense anymore. What we're really about is not human rights and liberty. It's really about might is rightism. And we'll do whatever we want because we have more power and money. And this is the point. That is the intrinsic structure of liberalism. And it will inexorably lead to that point. And we'll throw in a side of authoritarianism because that becomes prudentially correct. And again, if you have no moral criteria other than radical freedom, radical blank slatist freedom, you will only want to cultivate pluralism and respect diversity and so on, as long as it remains expedient under a calculus, which is ultimately the underlying structure of which is might is rightism. Mm-hmm. And that's what we saw there. So in a way, also, the appeals to human rights and international law, in a way, they were just laughing up their sleeves at us because they know that that's not what they really believe in. How long does the facade need to stay in place, right? That's the question. For Muslims, it was a moment of great clarity, but also it was another moment of, it was another moment in which we made manifest our insubstantiality, our lack of substantiality in this time, referencing the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, where he says that at the end of time we will become like the foeman detritus on the torrent. We'll just lack all substantiality. That's why that we will be overcome by our enemies. Because we were to be seen there credulously believing in an international system that is fundamentally bankrupt, and we shouldn't be so credulous. We shouldn't be there begging for justice at the table of international justice. Because, again, it's structurally rigged in order to ensure that there's no justice to be had. We should be able to see that.
So in the wake of liberalism, dead on arrival, as it were, it wasn't the end of history. Is it just pure will to power from this point onwards, and about who has power? It's telling about the UN, actually, that the Iran, despite everything, wasn't running to the the Security Council of the UN because they expected nothing, naturally, as they would. But what is now, in the wake of liberalism, the alternative for us, and what, as we've realized just how powerless we are as Muslims. I mean, we've been powerless since the post-colonial age anyway, and the responses to that really haven't left much to write home about. Let's say, Islamism, Islamic socialism, Islamic nationalism, resort to perennialism, and Iqbal's strange synthesis of Nietzscheanism and Darwinism. That's just led to further crises. So what have they all gotten wrong, and what can we learn from this current crisis about going forward, about how to best think about our place in the modern world, and how to retrieve, if anything, if that is the right approach of what we got right in the past?
Well, I mean, it's a very, very huge question, and I would be presumptuous to think that I can answer it fully. But what seems very, very clear to me is that we need to stop putting the cart before the horse. So we need to get our foundations right. That doesn't stop us from acting. We still need to act in the world. We need to be brave and chivalrous and have courage. I don't believe in quietism. I don't believe in pacifism. I don't believe in any of these things. But we also have to be wise. And if we're going to not be tacitly conforming to a worldview that we're purporting at the same time to reject, but acting in accordance with it,
Mm.
we can't put action and flux before knowledge and vision and realization. They really need to be simultaneous, but that foundation has to be there. If it's not there, we don't know what we're doing. We're acting blindly. And I think that is the problem the vast majority of the time, is that we are acting blindly, and then we put it in this dichotomies of, well, you're either an ivory tower, remove yourself from the world person who's given up, or you are a brave, person out there in the field of action. And neither of those are really quite right. We
Mm.
have to, I think, acknowledge that there is a compromise that we need to accept, um, even if it's not exciting or what we want,
Mm.
because it's just the nature of the time that we're in, idealizing utopias and creating little communities, and thinking that that's the be all and end all. It may be very beneficial, but it has to be done in a way which takes itself with a bit of a sense of humor and plenty of grains of salt, if you see what I'm saying. We
Yeah.
can't over reify or over concretize our efforts as if they are the only answer.
Yeah.
Everyone has their own role in this effort, but I think something which is absolutely, and so we shouldn't dismiss other people's roles, but I think one thing which is absolutely certain is that we need to revive a comprehensive metaphysical worldview. And it's not so much about revival. If we're real realists, we're not constructing this or creating it, we're recovering it. We're uncovering it as well, but it's from the vantage point of us in the very specific and unique challenges we face in this time at the particular point in history that we have reached. We have to reckon with all of the thinkers who have been around for the last 100 years and who have shaped society, and the trickle down has determined all sorts of things about the shape that society has taken, including in Muslim countries. And so, again, it can't be just this excavation and this kind of exercise in museum curation, which you often see passing for tajdeed or renewal. That's also absolutely disastrous. Um, and it just becomes another species of modernity, in a sense, in that we are, as it were, asserting our right to self-determine as a minority in creating our own conception of the good, and we have to be protected as such. I think also, a very, very important thing to move away from is, well, to be aware of the danger, is identitarianism. This idea that's very prevalent in the West, that just appearing with your scarf on or your hat on or with your beard on is sufficient. It's somehow in and of itself this extraordinarily brave and amazing statement. I just don't think that it is. I think that actually, because what we should have been doing and we must do is offer spiritual and intellectual remedies and relief insofar as we are Muslims, right, to our non-Muslims neighbors. That's what we should have been doing. And instead, we're playing into liberalist discourse by making our presence about asserting our right to be here, as with the kind of appearance that we have, and with the customs that we have. And you have to like us because I'm your GP, I'm
Mm.
your lawyer, I'm your taxi driver, and whatever. And
Mm.
that's not what Islam is not asking us to be a GP. And I'm not saying don't be a GP by all means, and don't be a school teacher and don't be whatever. But this idea that somehow, we should expect to be liked just because we're integrating into society, while all the time saying, oh, by the way, we're fundamentally different for no particularly good reason, but thank God for liberalism, which tolerates us. I mean, it's just
Mm.
not an inspiring vision.
No, I think
I'm not
our
sure.
our self-worth is only tethered even as Muslims, to our material utility to this liberal society. And
Exactly. Yeah.
as long as we meet our DEI quotas, we think we're serving the society, ignoring the fact that we only exist in an envelope that will beat us back into shape if we try to step out of that liberal facade that's
Absolutely.
represented to us.
Absolutely.
Um, but you quite rightly touched on the fact that at the fundamental core of it is a recent
I
book
think
and your
I
recent
think we,
series.
we lost you there for a moment. I think you froze.
Sorry, I said you spoke to the metaphysical crisis at the core of this, and you've written extensively about the five major bifurcations and severances in your book, and you spoke to a couple of them just now. Um, my so I recently just completed my PhD on the topic of loneliness, which is also
Mm,
presented as this major crisis of this time, and it is.
mm,
But over the course of that, the 4 years of writing that, what I became more and more convinced of was that at the root of loneliness was not something I could write in a peer-reviewed paper in a social psychiatry journal, but rather it was
mm,
fundamentally an ontological problem. The
mm,
modern subject, which began with the Cartesian split, as you pointed out, um, rendered itself lonely through, the only aspiration of it becoming was the monad, the individual. And Charles Taylor really writes greatly about this in
mm.
the Sources of the Self.
Yeah.
And then it renders itself utterly lonely as, for me at least, the philosophy that best exemplified that was existentialism, not as a descriptor, but how the modern self understands itself is like, the best is Dasein, like, the being there, being thrown into existence, and the only aspiration it can have is its being towards death, and the most only value it can have is authenticity, and the most authentic thing it do is die, and that's it.
Mm,
That is
mm.
nihilism embodied.
Yeah.
And that is what you would call an ontological crisis, an existential crisis, as it were. And that being exists without any ethics or any recourse to divine. And then, as you quite rightly said, within the liberal setup, you determine your own morality, whoever the most people consent to, and most of it has to do with material outcomes. Um, could you speak to that severance of ontology and ethics and where we find ourselves right now, and how that is actually exemplified in what we've observed over the past 2.5, almost 3 years, coming up to 3 years in Gaza? And just as an addendum of a question, and then we'll pivot to how, since it is a metaphysical crisis, what are the metaphysical solutions to this particular impasse that we find ourselves in?
Such a beautiful question. There are so many different strands that need to come together in order to answer it fully. And again, it's such a huge question, so fundamental to the challenges that we're facing today that, in a way, it's almost not a serious thing for me to try to answer it in just a few minutes. But I mean, I think what it fundamentally comes down to, on one level, is our fundamental theoretical and metaphysical convictions that linger even in a thoroughly sub-philosophical and post-metaphysical age. John Stuart Mill, I think it's a beautiful thing that he says in his famous essay on Bentham and Coleridge. He says, to superficial men, theoretical philosophy is the thing they consider to be most distant from their everyday concerns. It's a pure luxuriation in your ivory tower, and it really absolutely doesn't matter. But he says the reality is, it is the single thing which most influences their everyday life. It's just that they're not aware of it. And so, of course, if you're not doing your own metaphysics will be happening to you, but it will just be done by someone else, and you'll not be aware of it, which puts you in a very, very weak position. Essentially, after Kant, we exist in a situation philosophically in terms of the ascendant philosophies, which are wrangling it out in the academy, and then in terms of the trickle down to uh, common wisdom, we are living out this dogmatic assumption of the severance of knowing and being. And so, of course, Kant makes his own very idiosyncratic moves. His critical project, which is so extraordinarily influential, is premised on the question of how can I account for the fact that the non-empirical apparatuses by which I know the world cannot possibly have been derived from the sensible particular world itself. And at the same time, the world which depends on these non-empirical categories and concepts in order to make sense, right, cannot possibly have been caused by our minds either. It can't be that it's somehow this crystallization of these subjective concepts. But the question he then asked is, well, why on earth is it the case that when I understand the world, when I experience the world, it is inexorably this fusion of non-empirical, empirical, intelligible principles and direct, sensible experience, what he called intuitions. How can that be the case? How is it that the world appears to be intersubjectively, I should say rather, the world appears to be objectively intelligible, objectively knowable to us, when it's composed of these elements which are fundamentally subjective? And his conclusion, essentially, was to say that the reason the world appears to be objectively knowable is actually because it's merely intersubjectively knowable. Nature is actually created by our intersubjective cognitive apparatuses. And when we think that we're knowing the world as it is in itself, to put it in Mustafa Sabri's words, we're actually only knowing our own knowledge. And we can't get past it, right? Now, in under those conditions, we can and should pursue as apparently objective sciences. I mean, they're not in reality objective because we can't get beyond appearances, which is the shade cast by our cognitive apparatus, the structures of our cognitive apparatus, two things in themselves. But still, the impression of order and regularity, which results from the fusion of sensible intuitions, as in our direct relationship, the direct relationship of the knowing subject to the object given in sensation, right? The fusion of those sensible intuitions and the structures, the non-empirical structures of intelligibility imposed upon the mind, right? They yield an ordered world, right? Which is a world that is amenable to scientific exploration, to prediction and control. We're able to utilize, to capitalize on the intrinsic structure of human cognition in order to do things like predict eclipses, to create technology by undertaking experiments and seeing what works. It's all pertaining to the immanent, sensible world, right? Now, what he's rejecting is a traditional metaphysical worldview. And what he rejects about it is what he calls its dogmatism. He considers that before Enlightenment, right, prior to Enlightenment and the great changes of the scientific revolution and our awakening into the maturity of modernity, we naively thought that we could apply those non-empirical structures, those non-empirical frameworks of concept and principle, right, in order to uncover the nature of an intelligible world, in order to make contact with a realm which is genuinely non-empirical, right, genuinely transcends the empirical. That is exactly what he's critiquing when he critiques pure reason, right? The pure reason is reason not used in terms of the faculty that he does consider to be legitimate, that of the understanding, in order to apply itself to the empirical world, but rather used without an object to ground it, right, in order to uncover some sort of putative intrinsic structure to an intelligible world. Kant calls that merely grasping amongst concepts, right? And of course, we could get sidetracked by going into the details of his philosophy, which would not be very pleasant. But the point is that how is this significant for understanding our contemporary state? What people don't realize is that everyone today is a Kantian, even if and especially if they're saying that they're not one. Because what happens after Kant is, although the so-called continental and analytic traditions go off in radically different directions, analytic philosophy typically wanting to be very concerned with precision and logical analysis and subordinating itself rather slavishly to modern science, the physical science, the natural sciences, and even scientism in people like Quine, and the so-called continental tradition prioritizing subjectivity. What they both agree upon, and this is very, 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 this is not just one particular historian of ideas and their particular interpretation of the matter. This is widely agreed upon by historians of that era, of the emergence of these two traditions. What they both agree upon very strongly, despite disagreeing on everything else, is the Kantian rejection of the possibility of traditional metaphysics, right? That has very, very profound consequences, because what it means is not only metaphysics, but sciences which are in a traditional metaphysical model seem to be subordinate to metaphysics, like ethics, are likewise seen to be fundamentally impossible. An objectivist, not in the sense of Ayn Rand, an objectivist, realist ethics is impossible. And that is taken as a fact, which it's not, and is not even investigated. So that we have this situation in the modern world where we may be hugely intellectually sophisticated, right? But we're actually, in any traditional sense, sub-philosophical, because those real philosophical questions, including the question of a realist ethics, are already ruled out a priori. They're already ruled out a priori, right? And so if you go earlier than Kant, there is a reason for the separation of, well, one of the progenitors of our present separation of ethics and morality, and on the one hand, and metaphysics and ontology on the other, is the ascendancy of empiricism, especially of the Lockean variety, after the scientific revolution. And it's not just empiricism. Now, on empiricism, again, you are already a priori ruling out an objective science of the good, the true, and the beautiful, as in metaphysics, aesthetics, and ethics. Because if your starting principle and assumption about knowledge in the world is that ultimately all true knowledge claims about the nature of the world must be rooted in the senses, well, how are you going to root a claim about the good or a claim about the beautiful in a sense data, right? In a particular sense object. So what happens is, it's not that these questions stop being treated, because we still inexorably, as human beings, want to ask questions about these questions of ultimate human concern, but they become relegated to the realm of the subjective, right? Which means that there is no fundamental extramental starting point, and they are no longer to be treated as sciences. right? And so you get the beginnings of this hard separation between the sciences on the one hand and the subjective humanities on the other. Where is ethics? Well, it's going to land in humanities. But then again, where is the real, and thus it's not serious on one level. But then again, where does the very distinction between humanities, where is the very distinction between humanities and hard sciences? Where is that made? That's a dilemma for the modern world. They don't know how to answer the question. Right? And so, that very dogmatic assumption, which effectuates that crude split, is itself made in this kind of no man's land, which is not the hard sciences, and we're not quite sure where it is either. And so there are all sorts of different factors that lead to the state of affairs as it currently is. But when it comes to, just to allude back to what we were saying about post-October 7th and so on, and the breakdown of international law. International law is supposed to be universal and binding because it's rooted in natural law, which again presupposes a metaphysically realist vision of the possibility of knowing objective truths about moral questions. Right? So again, why would might is rightism be seen to be dominating every time it gets in a fight with international law? It's because that reflects the real convictions of those who have power, which is fundamentally a vision of what you could call a voluntaristic vision, metaphysical vision, in which what is fundamental to our knowledge of reality is not essence or an intrinsic nature of things which binds us and imposes itself upon us, but is the pure, unconditioned will of the individual. And that's all that is really there.
And if you do delegate ethics to the realm of empirical science, then whether you go for Kropotkin or, Herbert Spencer, it's arbitrary and that choice. And we're seeing the Spencerian or the Darwinian
survival of the fittest,
play out in real time. But what is that dogmatic slumber of Kant that he woke up from? And is that dogmatic slumber what will rescue us to bind that severance of that is and ought?
Beautiful. Well, we need to awaken from our own Kantian dogmatic slumber. You reference the way that he says that famously that David Hume helped him wake up from his own dogmatic slumber, and this was exactly Hume's pointing out that you can't actually root the principle of causality empirically, even though we it's presupposed rather in all of our cognition of the world. And this led Kant to not to become a Humean. He ended up refuting Humean extreme empiricism, which leads to Hume's phenomenalism in a way that's very, very powerful and fundamentally sound. But what this led him to realize is that we need to have a different treatment of why it is that we have these non-empirical principles, the pure concept of unity, of multiplicity, of this idea of substance, this idea of possibility, this idea of essence, these ideas which are non-empirical concepts that we can't represent the world without deploying, but yet don't belong to the extramental world in any straightforward way. What is waking up to Kant's dogmatism, and this is what my book, The Metacritique of Kant, is about. Waking up to Kant's dogmatism is to realize that he is himself guilty of just as egregious a form of dogmatism as the people he's critiquing, in fact, worse on many levels. For one thing, not everyone he critiques is a dogmatist. For another, there are a lot of philosophers he doesn't know about who are much loftier metaphysicians, much more profound and able metaphysicians than he is, who and philosophers than his who he simply doesn't understand the structure of their thought because of his particular, the kind of myopia and the intrinsic shortcomings of his own historical situatedness. But it's to realize that the reason there is an intelligibility in the rational ordering of the world, and we have these structures of principle and order in our rational faculty as well, and they match, they agree, right? Because he wanted to understand why they agree. And he ended up saying, well, the only way they can agree is if everything's imposed upon the object, is to realize that both the intelligibility that exists extramentally and the intelligibility that exists mentally come from a higher source, right? Beyond them both, which is the shared origin of them both. Okay. And that this is not a matter of faith, that this is something that can be deduced with absolute certainty. And again, that might come across as a dogmatic statement, but it can be substantiated. And it is the way that in the pre-modern view of the world, pre-modern order, in both the Christian and the Islamic world and elsewhere, this was common wisdom on the part of the masses and the height of certainty, the foundation of all certainty for whatever you want to call them, the intellectuals. And so, you know, if this was normativity before the advent of the modern, then it's modernity which needs to explain itself. And again, because we're caught in narratives of progress, which actually in reality only applies to things like iPhones, and doesn't apply to the good, the true, and the beautiful. In fact, the tendency is towards disintegration, deterioration, rather than any form of ascension. We imagine that, well, if the modern consensus is that hierarchical metaphysical view of the world has been superseded, then it must be true because of progress. And when you actually look at the factors which are more often social and political than they are intellectual that led to the ascendancy of the modern view, broad modern view about the impossibility of traditional metaphysics, and the way that, for example, in the 17th century scientific revolution, just to give one example, a methodological choice, which is that given that we want to master the world now instrumentally for our own material gain, it is better to look at it as a mechanism, in which case we need to exclude from our study of the natural world formal causes, which are essences, and final causes, which are purposes. A methodological, practical choice, which is to help us to achieve the Baconian knowledge as power, is misinterpreted in the unfolding in the history as a definitive statement of what is theirs. We know, no, there are no purposes in nature, right? Which is a completely dogmatic view, which has absolutely no supporting evidence whatsoever. It was a methodological choice that was made. That's just one example. But, you know, it's not that the greatest metaphysicians of the past were soundly refuted, but it's rather that the ascendant culture, the zeitgeist, moved on for reasons which were much more often psychological and societal and political than they were intellectual.
Right. So, as you quite rightly said, it's and to counter the illusion of progress, it's not so much about going forward or backwards, but uncovering what we already have. What in the Platonic and Akbarian legacy do we have that'll help us ameliorate that major methodological error that you just pointed out?
Well, one of them is realizing what I call faculty holism. and realizing that there are many different conceptions of reason, and that the conception of reason, the highly reductive conception of reason that tends to be dominant today, and by which we conceptualize ourselves as this paradigmatically rational society, when we're really anything but, is actually instrumental reason. It's this highly, highly reductive account of reason that is basically about adapting means to ends for your own material advantage, ultimately. And that's very, very far from what rationality ultimately means, from an understanding that there's a distinction between discursive rationality, what the Greeks called dianoia, what you might call in our tradition istidlal, and on the one hand, or what Ibn Arabi calls al-aql min haythu huwa mutafakkir, on the one hand, and on the other, nous, or what Ibn Arabi calls al-aql min haythu huwa qabil, the receptive intellect, or what you might call intuitive intellect, right? Which is that light within us, which we're using the term intuitive intellect to designate that miracle of consciousness itself, right? That miracle of consciousness itself, which without being a material object is able to represent the entire world to itself as a unity, right? And so it's that very light of consciousness that is able to know things directly, the meaning of things. And what the Platonic and Akbarian traditions have to offer us is to understand that if our knowledge efforts, and for want of a better word, our philosophical efforts and our practice of philosophy is not philosophy as a way of life, right? And an exploration of reality which in its explorations utilizes and brings to bear the entire human person with all of our faculties, but instead becomes this isolated discipline amongst other disciplines with all of these methodological assumptions which are highly historically contingent and so on. Again, it's that modern move which is odd and needs to explain itself, right? The Platonic assumption is what we know is determined by what we are, right? And what is most fundamental in what we are is that very light of consciousness itself. And so in the Platonic tradition, catharsis or self-purification is this absolute sine qua non of the acquisition of knowledge, because you can only reflect reality to the degree to which your mirror is polished, right? And if you have identified with your lowest possibilities, okay, because we as human beings find ourselves in this extraordinary situation, and it's a miracle, and we spend our whole lives kind of waking up to the fact that we are this meeting place between the spiritual and the material, or if you want, the angelic and the animal. We find within ourselves that we have this affinity with the corporeal world. We have a corporeal dimension, but we also have this aspect of our being and of our experience, right, which is incorporeal and spiritual and has direct access to the abstract and the intelligible and questions of truth, beauty, and goodness. And that's really where we are. Look at us right now as human beings. If we were purely corporeal, material beings, what on earth are we doing? I'm just sitting here waving my hands around and going blah, 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 blah. But we're in this, we're doing what, in the Arabic tradition is called jawalan al-aql fil ma'qulat. We are roaming in the intelligibles right now. Everything we're saying it's not about empirical objects, right? That's where we are fundamentally. And so what the Platonic tradition in its prioritization, unlike Aristotelianism, and I consider the immanentism of the Aristotelian, what I call the immanentism of the Aristotelian tradition, to be ultimately responsible for the breakdown of the medieval synthesis and the advent of early modernity. And that's a whole other story. But what the Platonic tradition offers is this prioritization of the whole, the fullness of the human experience in terms of all of our faculties, bringing to bear our discursive rationality and our senses, but most fundamentally, our capacity for spiritual experience, and realizing that if our view is blocked by our egoistic entanglements and our attachments to certain material objects and material outcomes, our ability to see reality is severely compromised. And this is something that the modern world simply doesn't understand. The idea there is that because everything's purely discursive and in the realm of the mind, and there's no requirement for self-purification, well, it's simply a matter of going and learning, ticking all the boxes, and then you'll come out knowing just as well as anyone else. But that's not what really seeing reality is about. It's something that transcends the discursive and demands this process of self-purification. But it's also to realize that, and again, the Akbarian and the Platonic traditions offer this, that is not a cop-out, as we might assume, and say, oh, okay, well, you're just saying go and be spiritual and, essentially don't take part in ordinary life, and you're going to become alternative, and there's this. It's another assumption of a split. You're going to be prioritizing the spiritual, but it's rather understanding that, as Sadruddin al-Qunwi, the son-in-law of Ibn Arabi, says, reason, as in discursive rationality, is merely one of the powers of the spirit, right? And so you can actually map out exactly when what crystallizes as a concept, which is then employed in discursive intellectual activity and the syllogism or whatever it happens to be, becomes a spiritual object, becomes a distinct spiritual experience. The point is there is a direct continuity, right, between the realm of what we ordinarily call the rational, discursive rationality and mathematical rationality and so on, and a higher mode of spiritual cognition. And this is exactly what the advanced Platonic traditions, what we call Neoplatonism, and the Akbarian tradition actually map out. So it's this comprehensive vision of reality. And so it's restoring the fundamental unity of reality rather than falling into the modern trap of thinking that everything has to be fragmented and compartmentalized.
I think that's the embodiment in an individual is the insan al-kamil, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I think that's where we move away from merely abstract concepts into, seeing it embodied in individuals. And you mentioned earlier Sheikh Muhammad ibn al-Habib, and we
Yeah.
began with the Sheikh Abdelkadir, and there's another enigmatic historical figure, that's Emir Abdelkadir al-Jazairi, who didn't just theorize or didn't just, read Futuhat, but embodied the synthesis of that traditional metaphysics and ethics, as we quite importantly said, and while fighting, the real anti-traditional modern machine, as we are today as well. So just quickly on that question, I know that you've spoken about him before, but who is the Emir and how can he serve? And as a synthesis of all the conversation that we've had so far, but how can he serve as a real practical living blueprint for the modern individual seeking to navigate our current metaphysical wasteland?
Well, I mean, who is Emir Abdelkadir Jazairi, Qaddasallahu Ruha? Engels, absolutely horrifying passage of one of his works, thinks of him as a primitive tribal leader, and he thinks that his capture is a great progress for society, and for human civilization. And the reality is, Emir Abdelkadir Jazairi was a great metaphysician, and he was a realized Akbarian saint. And, well, he was a realized saint who was of the Akbarian Mashrab, and an extraordinary, fantastically sublime spirit. and he in the 1830s, in the wake of the fragmentation caused by the French invasion of Algeria, he was called upon to become the Emir and the leader of the resistance, and he unified the tribes in this very Muhammadan, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, this very prophetic role. And he manifested Muhammadan character every step of the way. And he's very famous for his treatment of French prisoners of war. He's famous for his valor on the battlefield, but also for his justice and his very keen, unwavering commitment to his ethical principles. He would allow French prisoners access to their priest and allow them to carry out their worship and so on. And he's also someone who, when he realized that, it says in the Quran, وَلَا تُلْقُوا بِأَنفُسِكُمْ إِلَى التَّهْلُكَةِ, don't throw yourselves into destruction. So he did what he needed to do, and this is what the perfect man, the Khalifa, does, right? Because his focus was always on ubudiyya and manifesting the haqa'iq and the spiritual realities. It wasn't rigidly saying, I've got to just be a warrior, I've got to just be a pacifist, or I've got to just be... Yeah, he did what he needed to do at the particular time. But when it became clear that it was going to be the destruction of his people to continue, he did call a stop. And he was betrayed. And he was hugely revered even by his captors because of his extraordinary spiritual presence and his adab and so on, and his extraordinary cultivation and erudition. And then he famously has the moment in the wake of this Maronite Druze conflict, was it, in Mount Lebanon, that then spills over to Damascus, in this extraordinary rescue mission of the Christian population of Damascus, in which he would actually pay money for people to bring in Christians safe and sound who were being targeted by an angry mob. So he was an extraordinary individual because he is this elevated metaphysical writer in books like the Mawaqif, some of extraordinary spiritual attainment, spiritual presence, but absolutely a man of action when it was needed. And this is exactly what the perfect man on the model of the Prophet ﷺ is. We're not a people where the apex of, or a religion where the apex of holiness and spiritual realization is to withdraw from the world. It's rather to be in the world, as you said earlier, but not of it. And that is the difference between fana and baqa. It's why the Prophet ﷺ, when he was given in the Mi'raj, the choice to remain, he said, no, I want to return to the world. And it's realizing that this is, at that level of spiritual realization, this world is not somehow of a lesser spirituality or holiness. It's just one more manifestation. And so, it is the cultivation and the stewardship of the world which is required, and that must translate on a certain level in a certain context to action, of all sorts of different kinds of action. And fundamentally, Sufism is about chivalry. It's about being a real human being who doesn't shy away from the different aspects of our being. And that's why, this is also our understanding of the perfect man as embodied most perfectly in the Prophet ﷺ, who is simultaneously a lawgiver, ruler, warrior, father, husband, mystic, right? And a tradesperson. And all of these extraordinary at a certain point, and all of these different aspects. This also plays into this understanding of faculty holism on a different level, that we need to be complete human beings Um, Emir Abdelkadir is an extraordinary example of that.
Mm. So the aspiration is to be a Khalifa and a complete human rather than the Home Secretary in the upcoming cabinet, right?
I couldn't have said it better.
All right, so I think we've covered ground today, like from the collapse of the Western philosophical framework to the towering example of Amir Abdelkadir. For the listener, just trying to process the collapse and striving to embody an integrated, holistic Islamic reality in their daily life. What's your final counsel to them?
Well, I think what we need to do more than anything else is prioritize truth, beauty, and goodness, and try to some extent, distance ourselves from the identitarian, and focus on content, and especially self-purification, trying to um, fix ourselves before we try to fix society, to stop putting the cart before the horse, right? And so I think a return to traditional Islamic spirituality, more than anything else, that we need to fall in love with deen. And the most important aspect of that is the return of a Mohammedan spirituality, a spirituality which prioritizes the spiritual presence of the Prophet ﷺ, because that is our normativity historically. And I
Mhm.
think the loss of that is the single greatest tragedy that has afflicted our community. And if you want to look at everything else that has gone wrong since then, it's really a furrow or a branch of that fundamental error, which has all
Mhm.
sorts of different causes on so many different levels. But the cultivation of that uh, Muhammadan presence and the realization that the Prophet ﷺ, the spirit of the Prophet ﷺ is as a living spirit and a nourishing spirit, and that is the source, that is the wellspring of our spirituality, and always has been.
Mhm.
And the efforts to make that look like an impairment of Tawheed have been not only bizarre and kharij, away from historical Islamic normativity and unjustified, but they've had terrible consequences, and they've led ultimately to us falling into all of the very bifurcations and splits and that kind of fragmented view of reality
Mhm.
and the absence of holism that we're now combating and having to face. So I think
Mhm.
that is deeply, deeply important. That's the single most important foundation, I think. And everything else will follow on from that, inshallah ta'ala.
And may we all become Tom Bombadil one day.
I mean,
So, on a final point, you have made a return to Twitter, thankfully, and I'll leave in the comments of the new account, like and after what you have returned. It was a long absence, but where else can people find your work and engage with your writing and lectures?
well, I'd be very happy if people were to read my books. I have four books. The first one was published in 2021. It's called Things as They Are. It's essentially a defense of objective truth and the possibility of objective truth beyond the domain of the empirical. So it's kind of rescuing the notion of science in its original sense of scientia from its appropriation by the modern natural sciences. And then the second book is the Meta Critique of Kant, which is in a way a kind of appendix to Things as They Are,
Mhm.
which is showing essentially that Kant is uh, just as dogmatic as those he is purporting to critique, and that he misses out on he doesn't really understand the type of philosophy that actually is completely immune to his criticisms. Um, and then the third is Hierarchy of Freedom, which is essentially trying to identify the essence of modernity, and that essentially Enlightenment modernity is
Mhm.
premised on this conception of freedom, which presupposes the dismantling of hierarchy, and assuming that hierarchy is imposed because of in the service of power interests and so on. What this is arguing is essentially that modernity didn't invent the idea of freedom. Freedom is extremely important. Individual freedom is central and very important to our Islamic, authentically Islamic understanding of the world, because it's a precondition of taklif. But hierarchy is not imposed or conventional, it is intrinsic. It doesn't lock us in place or impair social mobility or anything silly like that. And it's actually a precondition for freedom. It's the only way for true freedom to be possible. So that's one of the things I argue there. And the most recent book is the first volume in a well, it may end up being 4-volume um, uh, exploration of metaphysics and modernity, which is called The Unraveling of Intelligibility.
And I think volume 2 is due very soon, right?
Volume 2 is due this October, inshallah ta'ala.
Sure. Yeah, that'll make it a success. All right. Thank you so much, Sheikh, for your time and sharing your
Thank
wisdom
you.
and thoughts and joining the podcast. Inshallah, we'll have you not long before in the future. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.